Hello, I'm Dahio Kiran and you're listening to Poetic Synergy, a programme that explores Eastern influences on the work of some Irish poets. Later on, I'll be meeting with a group of panellists who will explore these Eastern influences on this particular poet's work. This week, I'm in the company of poet Philip McDonagh. Philip, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much, Dahi.
Philip, the poems that you've chosen for today's programme are all based in India. Could you tell us how you became interested in India and what personal influences in your life influence your poetic work?
I think that, like anyone brought up in Ireland, I was always conscious of India. I think we all know about Gandhi, for example. India is one of the countries in the world which is on the map for us. But then in my case, I married Anna from India. She's actually from Bombay. And so I came to have very close personal connections with India. And then in my work for the Department of Foreign Affairs, I was posted to India and I lived there for 5 years. And we adopted our 2 daughters in India. So in fact, we're very closely connected. As to how that affects poetry, that's a very interesting question. And I suppose there's a lot of things that could be said about it. But one thing is that, speaking in general, I don't start from the point of view of India as the mysterious East, and us as the scientific West. My poetry is not really East meets West, but I'm looking at India maybe as many Indian people do. The contemporary India, the questions that arise for the contemporary India, how to relate to the history of India, and so on.
Could you tell us a bit about the journey? Because you said you view India now as maybe a contemporary Indian person.
Yes.
What change occurred in your writing style as a result of that?
One major discovery I made was that many Indian people have a loyalty and a devotion to what they do, which to me doesn't fit into our way of looking at things. I've tried in the poem Memories of an Ionian Diplomat to touch on that. That's a poem which I wrote as a kind of echo of a poem of Dennis Devlin's. Dennis Devlin has a poem, Memoirs of a Turkoman Diplomat. So I thought I would write about the experience of a diplomat in India. And it started from a colleague of mine who came to the end of his country's EU presidency in India. And he took the trouble to spend several days writing handwritten personal letters to people who had worked with him over the 6 months of his presidency. And it struck me that that kind of courtesy and dedication was very like the loyalty shown by many Indian people to their role in life. And I thought I should try to capture that as something distinctively Indian. That's just one example.
And in this poem, you mentioned costume change, right?
Yes.
And you also later on in the poem talk about a life lived out of context. Could you tell us about how your costume changed as a person immersed in that culture?
Well, I don't think you have to be in a faraway place like India to have this experience. Mm-hmm. That, in life you move from one stage to another, and you find that things that were very dear to you have changed and moved on. So although you're right that I talk about that in that poem, and it's about the situation of an expatriate, somebody who's working far away from home, I think the idea that things change and you've got to look for things underneath the surface that don't change, I think that's an experience which anyone might have.
I'm impressed by this poem because it's like a flickering dream to me, and you used the line, the evanescent womb of India. And
yes.
I looked up the meaning of the word effervescent, and it said, soon passing out of sight,
yes.
memory or existence,
yes.
or quickly fading or disappearing. So
yes.
something's changing and something's staying. Could you tell us
yes.
a little about that?
Well, this brings me back to the question of this special kind of loyalty or devotion which I found in some Indian people. In fact, one way in which I approached the subject was through a book I had read a long time ago called The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis talks about love in the family, romantic love, and charity, and so on. He tries to classify the ways in which people love. And it struck me that in India I had found another wavelength. And in this poem I'm trying to explore that. I mean, all the different ways in which we love, I think, converge in some way. You know, that I wouldn't make a big dichotomy between the love for another person and the love which lies behind an act of justice. I think these different loves converge. But into this spectrum, I was trying to insert another wavelength, which is, it's actually close to the caste system. That there is a way of life available to someone who lives by the caste system, which is about giving themselves totally to a position in society and expecting back a similar loyalty from others. Now, this is very delicate territory, because in my other poems about India, I'm looking at the question of justice very much through philosophical eyes. I have a poem about the abuse of prisoners in this prison camp which was set up in the 19th century. So usually I think my priority is to think rationally about justice, but I wanted to give some recognition to this aspect of Indian lifestyle, which is hard to express, but that's what I was trying to describe in that poem, that underneath the evanescence, as you say, or underneath the routine and the limitation of a person's situation, there can be a real love which makes up in some way for that.
You talked about justice.
Yes.
And justice comes across strongly in your poems. You made reference there to the prisoners, and you also have a beautiful poem, Saving the Balloons, which is about an orphanage, and you have references to Edmund Burke in Bengal.
Yes.
And you talked about drifting. Would you like to explore one of those poems with us?
Well, one I think that's quite easy to explain is Burke in Bengal. Edmund Burke, of course, was very moved by injustice in India. He was very moved by what the East India Company was doing in India, and he made some of his famous speeches about it. And in particular, there's a quote from Edmund Burke that has stuck in my mind. He said, "I know what I'm doing, whether the white people like it or not." When he tackled the colonial power in Bengal, that's what he said. Now, I would say two things on top of that. One is that there's this great new philosophical work by one of India's leading writers, Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, which is about international justice. It came out just a couple of years ago. And the introduction to Amartya Sen's book is about Edmund Burke in Bengal. And Amartya Sen is saying, how can we bring the instincts of Edmund Burke to bear on the global situation today? So Edmund Burke's role is recognised in modern India, but far more movingly, and this is what brings me to my poem, under our Irish Aid programme, we gave some help to a healthcare project in a very remote island in a place called the Sundarban. The Sundarban are mangrove swamps which stretch way, way south of Calcutta and are on the border with Bangladesh. And this place where we had our Irish Aid project had never been helped by a government before, and no diplomat from any country had ever been there before. And we went for the opening of the project. And we arrived by boat. It was a 24-hour journey by boat to get to this island. And when I got off the boat, there were a large number of villagers present who had come from a number of different islands to greet me and my wife. And a man in a dhoti, which is this long white garment, he came up to me very, very politely and said, "Sir, sir," and I turned round, And he told me that he had come from a very far island because he heard that the Irish ambassador was coming, and he wanted to thank me for Edmund Burke. And those were his exact words: "Thank you, sir, for Edmund Burke." I felt that Edmund Burke would have been, far more happy with that tribute than with figuring in the introduction to Amartya Sen's book. So I tried to write this short poem about that experience.
Could you read it for us?
I'll be glad to. This is Burke in Bengal. Out in the Sundarban, 8 hours by boat from Calcutta, who would remember Ireland? Rivers abut on swamp. No diplomat has come this far within the mapless mire of mangrove and mudflat since independence. They're going to welcome us, the villagers we've aided, on a patch of land suspended under a white moon. Someone calls out, "Sir," a barefoot man in a white dhoti, full of the will to speak. I've travelled here by dark, by river. As a teacher and a Bengali, I thank you, sir. Thank you for Edmund Burke. As if the land had spoken, comes to me a Burkean phrase. The clubbable companions, company men, who harvested rupees as millions hungered in sweat, have somehow vanished. Of blood and flesh, these children of the land, alive in the melody of drawn-out time. The creeping channels of the Sundarban run home to ocean, the eternal stream.
Beautiful. You talk about justice, and there's a poem called Saving the Balloons, which is about orphans, and in some sense I'm struck by the injustice, but also so much love and hope comes out of this poem.
Well, that poem is a very personal poem, because we got to know, when we were in India, a very fine institution called Palna. It's an orphanage run by an organisation in Delhi, and its most noticeable feature is that mothers can abandon or relinquish their children by placing them in a large basket which is set into the wall of Palna, and when the weight of the child goes onto the basket, that rings a bell, and the people inside can take the basket in, and so the child begins a new life. And sadly, there are, unfortunately, mothers and families whose lives are so difficult that they see this as a release for their child. And when we first encountered this basket, we were very moved. First of all, we connected the Irish Aid Programme to some of the programmes of the orphanage, and then the Department of Enterprise and Employment, which it then was, but that department were in Delhi on a trade mission, and Jerry Donnelly of the department set up a major fundraising exercise on behalf of Palna Orphanage. So then we had an ongoing Irish relationship with the orphanage, and so we then invited the children from the orphanage to some parties in the embassy. Normally they had to go to bed at 6 o'clock. There was no one to take care of them after that, and so we tried to have some parties where they would come out and we'd have bouncy castles and so on. One of the moving aspects was that the children were so happy at the party that when they left, they went round trying to gather up all the balloons, and they'd start untying them from door handles and from trees. So when the children got into their bus, it was full of these balloons up to the ceiling. And eventually my wife and I decided we would adopt ourselves, and that was as a result of that relationship with the orphanage. And I was moved to write this poem when the lady who ran the orphanage for many years passed away. And this poem is trying to capture something about her work and about that orphanage. I suppose when you go to a place like that, you fear the worst, because you think that there won't be any joy. And I found in some of these orphanages in India there was real joy. I do bring in Gandhi into the poem, which is very important to me because it's a connection between, you might say, personal and public justice. And the reference I have to Gandhi is actually true, because we had a fundraising event for that orphanage in our embassy. And at the time, there were great fears that what we call sectarianism maybe in this island, and they call communalism in India, would take off. There had been very serious riots and serious loss of life in India, and there were great fears for the future of Indian politics. And this very senior Indian figure said to me, above all the noise of the reception, "The barefoot voters remember the Mahatma." And he said this as a sort of guarantee that there's a safety net in Indian society against extremism, which is that the barefoot voters remember the Mahatma. And I think that's true. And I wanted to somehow weave that story into the story of the orphanage.
I was wondering, could you read us the verse entitled Unscripted Time?
Thanks, Dahi. Unscripted Time begins for us peripherally that Christmas with Yvonne's leftover money. Mrs. Kumar, Aruna, welcomes us, minus all rhetoric. Over sugary tea, unscripted time will speak the miracle. So much material for tears, and yet these happy children. Later a whole department contributes out of payslips to support a clinic for newborns. A prejudice that's second best for love-lorn little ones should not be thought enough builds Tir na Nog, the orphanage's playground. An unplanned journey is guided to the royal road by chance, as muses draw down carelessly a measure from the incorrigible spheres.
Now, to celebrate and explore the connective synergy in Philip's poems, I'm joined by Joe Woods of Poetry Ireland and Gerard Smith, poet and journalist. You're both very welcome to Poetic Synergy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dahi.
In my discussion with Philip there, we see that he's a diplomat and has had a huge influence on his work as a poet. And one of the poems that he's brought for us today is Memories of an Ionian Diplomat. Joe, would you like to say what you see in that poem?
Well, I think it's interesting that the fact that Philip is a diplomat, in the sense that he's working from a tradition of, there's been quite a lot of diplomat poets, and the more I look at it, the more I seem to discover, from Octavio Paz to Neruda, and then we have our own poets in the past, Valentine Ermonger, Dennis Devlin, and even more recently Richard Ryan, and they're all people in the Department of Foreign Affairs who have been poets and in other missions. I think it's interesting the way it puts Western philosophical concepts against Eastern ones, but also that kind of the way it merges an ancient diplomat poet with one living in the contemporary world.
And for you, Gerard, what's your impressions of the diplomatic element of this poem?
Well, Philip's introduction to the poem, he cited Dennis Devlin, who is probably one of our best-known poet diplomats in the past, and he recalled Devlin's poem, Memoirs of a Turkoman Diplomat. In that poem of Devlin's, there is a line, if I recall it correctly, "We all have a magic kingdom, some have two." I think the diplomat has this extra gift in leaving the home place and in going abroad and bringing what is usually a very cool eye to that local. There's another Irish poet, Thomas Kinsler, has this wonderful phrase about local watchfulness, which I think the diplomat brings to a place. This cool eye, monitoring the contemporary moments in history that take place in the position in which he's placed. I think that brings and enriches the poetry that comes out of the role of diplomat. Again, Devlin has this phrase, heart affairs diplomat. Philip's engagement, obviously, with India, especially when he spoke about injustice and justice, I think emerged very strongly through several of the poems.
You've referred to the cool eye of the diplomat coming in as an outsider looking at events in India, Jerry. He refers to India's obsession with power there when he refers to some daily papers were brought in.
You've used the word weaving, I think, and all through Philip's work, I see this interweaving. There is the classical, there is the past, antiquity, and then we come into a contemporary situation, and it happens time and again in the work, where knowledge obviously comes into play. The diplomat is also a witness, a witness in a time and a place, and this is probably coming from Philip's diplomat function. A diplomat is meant to be well read on the local ground. He spoke about connections between Ireland and India. I do think there would be a heightened sensitivity on the part of an Irish. We get it in the prison poem, and we can speak about that separately, where Ireland and India are linked very much. But I think it's the diplomat poet as witness that is making the comment on power, because power often is the instrument of forms of injustice, and I suspect that's somewhere in behind that comment.
And I think there's a parallel as well with, in the poem like Kalapani, where there's a kind of a parallel with our own, struggle with independence and the various uprisings, which in a way almost parallels India's, certainly in the time frame. And it's interesting how Philip is looking at prisoners in an Indian context, and then evoking the dead in Kilmainham, and evoking them by name.
So in some sense, what Jerry was talking about earlier is bringing him part of himself as an Irish person in his cultural context, and he's making a cultural connection. And maybe it's a bit like what the psychotherapist Jung talked about. Cultural memory is actually so deep that in some sense the connection actually occurs at that level.
But he's also bringing, I think, a wonderful imaginative freedom, because he's going into a new place. In another poem, not an Indian poem of Philip's, Carrow in Saxony, he has this phrase, which is a wonderful elegy for his mother, but he has this phrase in which he's talking about his mother viewing Dresden, the poem set in Dresden, as an extreme wonder. I think it's a wonderful way of describing a place, and I think Philip in India finds the place as an extreme wonder, and it's a great description of place for someone who has come in as an outsider and has left, to a large extent, there's no baggage, the cool eye, the clear eye, but attached to this is, as the poet, is the imaginative freedom. He's not an Indian poet,
and there's a kind of a deep, I think, in there's the juxtaposition of Carrow and Saxony, but then you also have these constant juxtapositions of place, and a kind of a sense of an overlay of place. And I think also what distinguishes these poems in many ways is they're not travel poetry in the sense of postcard poems. They're very serious investigations of place and of history and of themes like justice and injustice, but they come also with a real erudition and a real attachment to, on the one hand, getting the poem right, and in some cases as well with Philip's work, there's always a certain formality working with the poems in terms of their rhymes and their structures, but at the same time they're serious pieces of work in the sense that they're not just common associations with being adrift, with being abroad, with that's often associated with travel.
What I found fascinating was this introduction of the person who was actually the first European diplomat to India, Megasthenes, who's referenced in the poem, and by all accounts his initial investigations of place, if you like, which is the duty of a diplomat. He doesn't stay in his room; he goes out. And by all accounts, Megasthenes, who might have been the model, his recordings of what he found and saw and experienced in India were hugely influential for years. He was the Greek ambassador. And I think, the repetition of that, the continuity, Philip speaks about time as well. And I think the continuity of time, some things don't change. And that's the kind of connection that he makes to place.
And maybe that's what Philip was talking about in his interview earlier, is discovering what's underneath. And maybe in some sense he has a connection to tradition, philosophy, both Eastern and Western, and to diplomacy in his work. And the poem Burke in Bengal, not only was he a diplomat, but he was raised in Munster, and that his family actually had Owen Rua Surawan as a tutor to one of his granaunts. I just wonder, in some sense, this sense of being part of the British system as Irish people, that we have experienced colonialism, but we actually can be within it and actually diplomatically rebel.
Well, not just Burke in Bengal, but if you take Roger Casement, there is a parallel there. You know, Casement was the Irishman who, on behalf of the British, you know, goes to South America, goes to the Congo, unveils the injustices that were being committed there. Similarly, that you know, wonderful line from Burke that Philip quotes before, with the poem, "I know what I am doing, whether the white people like it or not." You know, that is, you know, the Irish instinct to actually get out there and confront the injustice is something obviously that Philip feels very strongly about. And I think, you know, in a different way, the orphanage poem that you spoke about and which you read from, you know, the injustice of there being orphans in the world is something that, you know, is very close to him.
I sometimes think, you know, sometimes we have to remind ourselves that we're, you know, a post-colonial culture. We forget it sometimes that this is you know, in a sense, a culture that was to some extent imposed upon us. So I think that, you know, that's an awareness that's in the poem. And I mean, there's that that marvelous line again, which in some way just shows the investigation of the subject of the man Burke, you know, with that wonderful line, "alive in the melody of drawn out time" again, you know, because it's that sense of the using his own language to his own term to celebrate him. You could also say it's a poem that's given to you, in the sense that it's a complete epiphany. You know, it's got that wonderful sense of epiphany about it.
So in some sense, the diplomat is quite a rebellious man in a sense, and maybe that's the synergy that he's creating within this poem, is the balance of the diplomat plus the person who says, wait a second, there's something I'd like to protest about here. So on that distinctive note, thank you so much, Jerry and Joe.
Thank you.
This series has been kindly funded through the Sound and Vision Scheme, which is a funding scheme from the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.